At 12:30 p.m. on November 24th, 1944, Staff Sergeant Arthur Billings sat in the rear plexiglass blister of a B-29 Superfortress named Dauntless Doy, watching a swarm of Japanese Ki-44 Tojo fighters climbing vertically to kill him. He was 30,000 feet above Tokyo, an altitude where the air is so thin that a human being will pass out in 45 seconds without oxygen. Outside the glass, the temperature was 50 degrees below zero. Inside, Billings was sitting in a padded chair, wearing a light flight suit, sweating from the sheer tension of the moment. He wasn't freezing. He wasn't wrestling a heavy machine gun against a 300 miles per hour slipstream. He was sitting in a warm, pressurized cabin that felt more like a dentist's office than a battlefield. But that comfort was terrifying. It felt fake. To a gunner who had cut his teeth on the B-17, where the wind screamed through open hatches and the brass casings burned your neck, this silent, hermetically sealed bubble didn't feel safe. It felt like a coffin waiting to be cracked open. To understand why the gunners of the 20th Air Force were terrified of their own airplane, you have to understand the engineering nightmare of the B-29. It was the most advanced machine of the war, a shiny silver beast that cost $3 billion to develop, more than the atomic bomb project. It was designed to fly higher and faster than any bomber in history. But achieving that height created a deadly problem. At 30,000 feet, you can't breathe. The designers couldn't just give the crew oxygen masks and open the windows. At that altitude, the cold would freeze the hydraulic lines and the men. So they decided to pressurize the entire fuselage. They pumped air into the cabin to simulate an altitude of 8,000 feet. They turned the plane into a flying Coca-Cola bottle. This created a submarine trap. A submarine is safe as long as the hull is solid. But if you punch a hole in it, the pressure blows out and the ocean rushes in. In the B-29, if you cut a hole in the fuselage to stick a machine gun barrel out, all the air would rush out. The crew would get the bends, pass out, and die. You couldn't have open gun ports. You couldn't have ball turrets spinning around with men inside them breaking the seal. The plane had to be a smooth, unbroken tube of aluminum. But a bomber without guns is just a target. The engineers were stuck. They had built a plane that could reach Japan, but they couldn't figure out how to defend it once it got there. The Japanese pilots knew this. When the first B-29s arrived in the Pacific, the enemy treated them like whales. They knew the Americans were hiding inside their pressurized shells. They attacked from high angles, diving down from the sun, or they came up from underneath, slashing at the soft belly of the giant. They knew that if they could just crack the glass, the Superfortress would lose its pressure and be forced to drop down to lower altitudes where the anti-aircraft guns could chew it up. The early missions were disasters. The defensive systems were clumsy. The gunners felt helpless, trapped behind double-paned glass, watching the enemy fighters dart around them like sharks circling a bathysphere. The solution that General Electric came up with was something out of a science fiction comic book. They proposed a system called Central Fire Control. It was a radical idea that stripped the gun out of the gunner's hands. Instead of standing behind a .50 caliber machine gun, bracing his shoulder against the recoil and aiming down a steel barrel, the gunner would sit in a remote station. He would look through a sighting device that looked like a pair of fancy binoculars. He would track the enemy plane with this sight, and 40 feet away outside the pressurized cabin, a robotic turret would wake up. It sounded insane. The gunner would move a dial and a computer, not a digital chip, but a mechanical brain made of gears, cams, and mirrors, would calculate where the gun needed to point. It would send an electrical signal to motors in the turret. The turret would spin, elevate, and fire. The gunner would never touch the weapon. He would never feel the vibration. He would just press a button on a plastic handle and a plane half a mile away would explode. It was the birth of the video game war decades before video games existed. When the veteran gunners first saw the system, they hated it. They didn't just dislike it. They mocked it with a venom that only soldiers can muster for new equipment. They looked at the sighting stations with their little black knobs and glass reticles and called them Buck Rogers toys. They called the system, quote, Zero. To a man who had survived the slaughter of the European theater, the idea of trusting his life to a box of electrical wires was offensive. They trusted grease. They trusted steel. They trusted the physical connection of muscle to metal. If a gun jammed in a B-17, you kicked it. You racked the bolt. You poured oil on it. You fixed it. But you couldn't fix the robot. If the central fire control system glitched, you were helpless. The gunners imagined the horror of watching a Zero fly right at them while they frantically twisted a dial that wasn't connected to anything. They argued that the system was too delicate. They said the vibration of the engines would rattle the vacuum tubes loose. They said the cold would freeze the grease in the gears. They looked at the electricians from General Electric, men in white lab coats who had never fired a shot in anger, and laughed at them. They called the B-29 1 because they were convinced that the first time they got into a real dogfight, the fuse box would blow and they would all die screaming. The mockery went deeper than just reliability. It was about pride. There was a machismo to being an aerial gunner. You were the sheepdog protecting the flock. You walked off the plane smelling of cordite and sweat with bruises on your shoulders from the recoil. The central fire control system turned the gunner into an accountant. He sat in a chair. He tweaked knobs. He didn't even have to lead the target. The computer did the math for him. It felt cowardly. It felt like cheating. The pilots joked that the gunners were just passengers now, riding along in the back, playing with their magic lanterns, while the real men flew the plane. But the black box didn't care about their feelings. It sat inside the fuselage, a dense brick of machinery the size of a bread box. Inside, it was a masterpiece of analog engineering. It contained a miniature model of the physics of flight. It knew things the gunner didn't. It knew the airspeed of the bomber. It knew the altitude. It knew the temperature. When the gunner pointed his sight at a Japanese fighter, the computer instantly calculated the parallax, the fact that the gun was 40 feet away from the sight. It calculated the drop of the bullet due to gravity. It calculated the windage, how much the bullet would be pushed by the 400 miles per hour wind rushing past the plane. And it did all of this instantly. A human gunner has to guess. He has to look at a plane zooming past at 300 miles an hour and guess where to shoot. He has to guess how much the bullet will slow down. He has to guess the wind. He is doing calculus in his head while terrified. The human brain is good, but it's not fast enough. The robot was faster. It adjusted the guns continuously, tracking the target with a smoothness that no human hand could match. It didn't flinch. It didn't get scared. It just pointed the barrels at the exact point in space where the enemy was going to die. On that November afternoon over Tokyo, The joking stopped. The swarm of Tojos wasn't a theoretical exercise. They were real and they were hungry. The lead Japanese pilot saw the big silver bomber and thought he saw an easy kill. He saw no open gun ports. He saw no muzzle flashes. He saw a fat, defenseless whale floating in the blue sky. He pulled his stick back and rocketed up from below, aiming for the glass nose of the giant. Inside Dauntless Doy, Sergeant Billings watched the fighter growing larger in his sight. His hands were sweating on the plastic grips. His instinct screamed at him to lead the target, to swing the sight ahead of the enemy plane, but the training manual said no. The manual said, "Put the dot on the bandit." It felt wrong. It felt like suicide. If he aimed at the plane, the bullets would fall behind it. Every fiber of his being told him the machine was going to miss. He had a split second to decide. Trust his gut or trust the glitch. He could try to override the system, try to guess the lead like in the old days, or he could surrender control to the gears and wires humming beneath his feet. The Tojo was closing fast, its cannons flashing. Billings took a breath of the recycled pressurized air. He clamped his hand on the dead man's switch. He put the glowing orange reticle directly on the cockpit of the Japanese fighter, and he pressed the trigger. When Staff Sergeant Billings pressed the trigger inside the pressurized bubble of Dauntless Doy, he braced himself for the violence. In a B-17, firing a twin .50 caliber turret was a physical fight. The floor shook. The smell of burning gunpowder filled your nose. The noise was deafening, a jackhammer pounding against your skull. But in the B-29, when Billings squeezed the plastic switch, nothing happened. There was no recoil. There was no smell. There was just a polite hum from the electrical relays. It felt like he had pressed a button on a radio, not a weapon of war. But 40 feet away on the top of the silver fuselage, the upper forward turret woke up with a violence that Billings couldn't feel. The electric motors, fed by the calculations from the General Electric computer, spun the heavy turret instantly. The two machine gun barrels didn't just point where Billings was looking, they pointed where the enemy was going to be. The robot had sensed the speed of the Japanese fighter. It had measured the drop of the bullets. It had factored in the 400 miles per hour wind whipping past the nose, and it had done all of this in the fraction of a second it took for the electrical signal to travel down the wire. The result was terrifyingly efficient. The stream of .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds didn't spray around the sky like a garden hose. They flew in a tight, rigid rope of fire. The Japanese pilot, climbing vertically to attack the nose, never had a chance to react. He was used to American gunners who tracked slowly, men who had to muscle heavy iron sights against the wind. He expected to see tracers drifting wide. Instead, he flew face first into a solid wall of lead. Billings watched through the plexiglass as the Tojo fighter simply disintegrated. One moment, it was a sleek metal shark screaming up from the clouds. The next, it was a fireball tumbling backward. The wings sheared off. The engine block, smashed by the heavy slugs, smoked and died. It happened so fast that Billings didn't even have time to feel relief. He just stared at the empty spot in the sky where the plane had been. The glitch hadn't glitched. The Buck Rogers toy had just swatted a 30,000 horsepower fighter out of the air without breaking a sweat. To understand why this was such a miracle, you have to look inside the little black box that the veteran gunners had mocked. It wasn't a computer in the way we think of them today. There were no silicon chips or lines of code. It was a mechanical brain. Inside the metal casing, there was a dense forest of gears, cams, and mirrors. It looked like the inside of a Swiss watch had exploded. When the gunner moved his sight, he wasn't moving a cursor on a screen. He was physically turning a shaft that spun a gear, which pushed a cam, which moved a mirror. It was an analog computer. It solved calculus problems using geometry. If the gunner tilted his sight up, a gear inside the box would spin to represent elevation. If the plane was banking, a gyroscope would tilt, pushing another lever to represent gravity. The machine would physically crunch these movements together. It was like a player piano that played bullets instead of music. The engineers at General Electric had figured out how to turn the chaotic physics of aerial combat into a math problem that could be solved by spinning metal wheels. The most magical part of the system was how it solved the cross-eyed problem. In a normal plane, the gunner is standing right behind the gun. He looks down the barrel. What he sees is what he hits. But in the B-29, the gunner might be sitting in the nose while the guns were 40 feet back on top of the fuselage. If the gunner looked at a target 500 yards away, the guns being 40 feet behind him would be looking at a slightly different angle. This is called parallax. It's the same reason your finger jumps when you close one eye and open the other. If you didn't fix this, the gunner and the gun would be cross-eyed. The gunner would look at the target, but the bullets would pass 40 feet to the left. The General Electric computer fixed this automatically. It knew exactly how far the guns were from the sight. As the target got closer or moved further away, the gears inside the box would whisper to the turret, "Tilt in a little more," or "straighten out." It triangulated the kill shot constantly, adjusting the angle of the guns so that the bullets in the gunner's line of sight met exactly at the enemy plane. It did this while the target was moving at 300 miles an hour and the bomber was bouncing through turbulence. As the air battle over Tokyo raged on, the crew of Dauntless Doy began to realize that the robot wasn't just working. It was doing things no human could do. The B-29 had 5 turrets, one on top of the nose, one on the bottom of the nose, 2 in the tail, and the tail gunner's own stingers. But it only had 4 gunners plus a bombardier. This meant there were more guns than men. In the old days, this would be a disaster. An unmanned gun is useless weight, but the central fire control system had a trick up its sleeve called handover. It was the ultimate party trick of the system. Each gunner had a panel with switches and lights. If a Japanese fighter attacked from the nose and then peeled off to fly down the side of the bomber, the nose gunner could track him until he was out of his view. Then, with the flip of a switch, he could hand off the control of his turret to the side gunner. Imagine a quarterback throwing a ball to a receiver, but instead of a ball, it's a pair of .50 caliber machine guns. The side gunner didn't have to scramble to a new weapon. He just took control of the remote turret. The guns would snap to follow his sight. A single gunner could control 1 turret or 2 or even 3 at the same time. If the top gunner was knocked out or busy, the side gunner could flip a switch and take command of the top turret, doubling his firepower. It turned the bomber into a porcupine that could shift its quills to wherever the danger was. The Japanese pilots were baffled. They were used to finding the blind spots on American bombers. On a B-17, if you attacked from a certain angle, the waist gunner couldn't reach you, because his gun hit the tail. But on the B-29, the blind spots kept moving. A pilot would dive on the tail thinking he was safe from the nose guns, only to see the top forward turret spin around 180 degrees and start shooting backward. The robot didn't care which way the guns were pointing. It just tracked the target. The plane felt alive as if the machine itself was watching them. By the time Dauntless Doy turned back toward the Mariana Islands, the mockery was dead. The gunners sat in their comfortable chairs, rubbing their eyes, not from the wind, but from the strain of staring through the sights. They hadn't fired a single shot with their hands. They hadn't touched a charging handle. They hadn't cleared a jam. The computers had done the heavy lifting. The floor around the remote turrets was covered in a carpet of spent brass casings ejected automatically by the guns. But the success of the system created a new problem: escalation. The Japanese were losing pilots at a catastrophic rate, but they were learning. They realized that the B-29 wasn't a soft whale. It was a flying battleship. They couldn't just slash at it with machine guns anymore. The robot was too fast. It swatted them down before they could get close enough to puncture the pressurized hull. So the enemy changed tactics. If they couldn't get close to the B-29s, they would have to hit them from somewhere the computers couldn't reach. They started moving their heavy anti-aircraft flak batteries. They concentrated them around the cities, creating walls of exploding steel that no computer could dodge. You can't shoot a flak shell with a machine gun. The robot could kill a fighter, but it couldn't kill a cloud of shrapnel. And then came the kamikaze tactics, the body crash. The Japanese pilots, realizing they couldn't outshoot the American computers, began to consider the ultimate countermove. If you can't shoot the bomber down, become the bullet. They started stripping the armor off their fighters to make them faster. They started climbing higher, waiting for the B-29s to enter the bomb run, where they had to fly straight and level. On a mission just a few weeks later, the crew of a B-29 looked out their blisters and saw something that chilled their blood. It wasn't a fighter trying to dogfight. It was a twin-engine Nick fighter flying straight at them, not firing its guns. The pilot wasn't trying to aim. He was staring straight ahead, his throttle pushed to the firewall. He was aiming his propellers at their wing. The central fire control system was a miracle of engineering, but it was built to track targets that behaved like rational pilots. It calculated lead based on the idea that the enemy wanted to survive. It wasn't programmed for a madman who wanted to die. The gunners swung their sights. The gears in the black boxes spun frantically, trying to calculate the solution for a collision course. The robot hummed, pushing the turrets to their stops. The Japanese plane grew larger in the glass, a screaming metal missile that didn't care about math. The gunner squeezed the trigger. The turrets roared. Tracers hammered the oncoming plane. Pieces of the enemy fighter flew off, cowling glass wingtips. But the plane kept coming. It was a dead machine flown by a dead man, guided by sheer momentum. The robot could kill the pilot, but it couldn't stop the physics of a 2-ton object hurtling through the sky at 400 miles per hour. The crew braced for impact. The video game war was over. The fist fight was about to begin. By January of 1945, the video game war over Japan had changed. The B-29 gunners were no longer the terrified rookies staring through plexiglass blisters, waiting for the robot to fail. They were believers. They had seen the General Electric computers swat fighters out of the sky with a precision that felt almost supernatural. But the Japanese were adapting. They had realized that the B-29 was a hard target, a flying porcupine that could track them through clouds, through darkness, and through the wildest evasive maneuvers. So they stopped trying to dogfight. They started trying to collide. The body crash tactics, known as kamikaze, were a nightmare for the Central Fire Control System. The computer was designed to calculate lid angles for a plane that was trying to shoot and survive. It wasn't designed for a plane that was trying to die. When a Japanese fighter committed to a ramming attack, it didn't bank or turn. It flew in a straight, screaming line. The closing speeds were insane, often over 600 miles an hour combined. At that speed, the computer had milliseconds to solve the geometry. On a mission over Nagoya, a B-29 named Stockett's rocket found itself in the crosshairs of this new madness. A twin-engine Nick fighter appeared at the 12 o'clock position. It wasn't maneuvering. It was coming head-on, its propellers spinning into a blur, aiming directly for the cockpit glass. The bombardier in the nose, sitting right in the path of the oncoming missile, grabbed his sight. He didn't have to shout orders to a gunner in the back. He just flipped a switch. This was the handover system at its most critical. In a split second, the bombardier took control of the upper forward turret and the lower forward turret. He became a one-man army. He swung his sight onto the nose of the suicide plane. The computer inside the black box sensed the incredible rate of closure. It spun the gears so fast they hummed. It tilted the .50 caliber machine guns almost to their mechanical stops. The bombardier pressed the trigger. A wall of fire erupted from the front of the B-29. It wasn't just a few bullets. It was a deluge. The four guns pumped out 50 rounds a second. The stream of lead met the Japanese fighter 1,000 yards out. It didn't just poke holes. It acted like a cheese grater. The cockpit of the Nick disintegrated. The pilot was killed instantly, but the plane kept coming, guided by momentum. This was the moment where the robot proved its true worth. A human gunner would have flinched. He would have seen the giant metal object rushing at his face and ducked. But the computer didn't flinch. It kept the guns locked on the center of mass. It poured fire into the wing root until the structural spars snapped. One wing folded up. The dead plane rolled violently to the right, missing the B-29's wingtip by less than 20 feet. The backwash rocked the bomber like a boat in a hurricane, but it was safe. The machine had stared down death and didn't blink. But the real test of the system wasn't just defending a single plane, it was defending the formation. The B-29s flew in loose streams, not the tight wingtip-to-wingtip boxes of the European War. This meant that a single bomber often had to cover its neighbor. The Central Fire Control System was perfect for this, because the turrets were remote. The gunners had a massive field of view. They could see threats attacking the plane next to them. On one legendary mission, a B-29 gunner named Sergeant Red Miller saw a Zero dropping down on the tail of a bomber, flying 500 yards to his right. The gunner on that plane was looking the other way. Miller didn't get on the radio to warn him. He didn't waste time. He just swung his sight. His computer calculated the range not to the enemy, but to a point in space where the enemy would be relative to his plane. It was a trigonometry nightmare. He was shooting across the formation past his own tail at a moving target, attacking another moving target. He fired a short 2-second burst. The tracers looked like they were going to miss by a mile. They curved through the thin air looking lazy and slow, But the computer knew the wind. The bullets drifted right into the path of the Zero. The Japanese pilot never saw it coming. He was focused on his target, completely unaware that a robot half a mile away had just calculated his death warrant. His fuel tank exploded. The B-29 he was attacking flew on, completely untouched. Miller just released the trigger and went back to scanning his sector. It was the ultimate gotcha. The psychological impact on the Japanese pilots was devastating. They were used to fighting men. Men get tired. Men get cold. Men get scared. If you harass a human gunner for 3 hours, his reaction time slows down. He starts missing, but the black box never got tired. It didn't care if the mission was 4 hours or 14 hours. The gears spun just as smoothly at the end of the day as they did at the start. The Japanese realized they were fighting a machine that was relentless. This led to a strange phenomenon. The Japanese fighters started hanging back. They would fly alongside the B-29 formations just outside the effective range of the .50 calibers, waiting for a straggler or a damaged plane. They treated the main formation like an electric fence. If you touched it, you died. The invisible wall of the central fire control system created a zone of safety around the bombers that no amount of flak or fighters could fully penetrate. However, the system wasn't invincible. It had a weakness, and it was the same weakness that plagued every high-tech weapon of the war: complexity. The B-29 was packed with wires, relays, and motors. If a single fuse blew, a turret could freeze. If a gear stripped, the computer would feed garbage data to the guns. The crews had to become their own technicians. They learned to kick the boxes. They learned to swap out parts in flight. They treated the robot like a temperamental pet. You had to feed it, pet it, and sometimes smack it to make it behave. The biggest challenge came from the friendly fire potential. With guns that could spin 360 degrees and point almost anywhere, there was a real danger of shooting off your own tail or hitting your own wing. The engineers at General Electric had thought of this too. They installed contour followers, metal cams cut into the shape of the B-29. As the turret spun, a pin traced the shape of the cam. If the guns pointed at the tail fin, the pin hit a bump on the cam and the firing circuit was cut instantly. It was a safety switch that saved hundreds of lives. In the heat of battle, a gunner tracking a Zero screaming past the tail didn't have time to check his clearance. He would just hold the trigger down. The guns would roar, then suddenly stop for a split second as they swept past the rudder, then roar again on the other side. It was like a machine gun synchronization gear on a World War I fighter. But in 3 dimensions, the gunners learned to trust it. They sprayed lead through their own formation, confident that the robot wouldn't let them shoot themselves down. By the spring of 1945, the air war had shifted again. The Americans began the firebombing campaign. They stripped the guns out of some planes to carry more incendiaries. They flew low. At night, the central fire control system wasn't needed as much for high-altitude defense, but when it was used, it was devastating. The night fighters would come up looking for the glow of the bomber exhausts. The B-29 gunners, using radar-directed aiming in some cases, would spot them in the dark. The radar-linked turrets were the final evolution of the system. A small radar dish on the tail could pick up an enemy plane in total darkness. The signal was fed directly into the computer. The gunner didn't even need to look through the glass. He just watched a blip on a screen, lined up the dots, and pressed the button. It was the birth of the modern automated weapon system. To the Japanese pilot flying in the pitch black, it must have seemed like magic. He would be stalking a shadow, and suddenly a stream of tracers would reach out of the darkness and tear him apart with mathematical precision. There was one story that circulated the mess halls of Saipan that summed up the vindication of the robot. A B-29 came back from a mission with its nose glass shattered by flak. The bombardier was dead. The pilot was wounded. The plane was limping home on 3 engines. A flight of 3 Zeros spotted the cripple and moved in for the kill. They thought it was over. The crew was battered. The defenses were down. But the central gunnery officer, sitting in his blister in the back, wasn't ready to give up. He flipped the master control switch. He took command of every remaining turret on the plane, the top, the bottom, and the tail. He became the conductor of a symphony of destruction. As the Zeros dove, he spun the top turret to catch the first one. Brut! Smoke. The Zero peeled off. He immediately switched his sight to the second Zero coming up from below. The bottom turret swung around. Brut! The wingtip of the fighter blew off. The third Zero, seeing his friends mauled, hesitated. That hesitation was all the computer needed. The officer swung the sight again. The tail turret and the top turret tracked the target together. He fired a convergence burst. The 2 streams of fire met at the cockpit of the Zero. It was like swatting a fly. The B-29 flew home, its gun barrels smoking, its computer humming quietly in the dark. The toy that the experts had laughed at had just saved 10 men from a watery grave. The system was so effective that the Army Air Forces actually started counting computer kills separately. They realized that the hit probability with the central fire control was 5 times higher than with handheld guns. It wasn't just an improvement, it was a paradigm shift. It proved that in the age of high-speed flight, the human eye and the human hand were the weak links. To survive in the sky, you had to hand the gun over to the machine. As the war drew to a close, the B-29 fleets roamed over Japan with impunity. The glass bubble executioners sat in their chairs, scanning the skies, almost bored. The Japanese Air Force had been decimated. The few pilots left were inexperienced and terrified. They knew about the silver monsters that couldn't miss. They knew that if they got within 1,000 yards, the invisible wall of the central fire control system would swat them down. The mockery of 1944 was a distant memory. The robot had won. When the atomic bombs fell in August of 1945, the war ended with a sudden, jarring silence. The great fleets of B-29s, which had blackened the skies over Tokyo for months, were suddenly grounded. The engines cooled, the propellers stopped spinning, and inside the pressurized cabins, the central fire control systems were powered down for the last time in World War II. The little black boxes that had calculated thousands of death trajectories sat cold and silent. The gunners, who had spent hundreds of hours staring through their plastic sights, climbed out of the hatches and walked away. They left behind a machine that had changed warfare forever, but nobody really stopped to look at it. In the celebration of victory, the robot was just another piece of heavy equipment like a landing gear strut or a fuel pump. But the scorecard told a different story. The statisticians at the Army Air Forces crunched the numbers, and they were staggering. The B-29 gunners using the remote control system had shot down hundreds of Japanese fighters. They had done it with fewer rounds fired per kill than any other bomber in history. They had done it while sitting in comfortable chairs, often without even raising their voices. The Buck Rogers toy that the veterans had mocked turned out to be the deadliest defensive weapon of the war. It had turned the clumsy, freezing job of aerial gunnery into a cold, hard science. The glitch hadn't just worked, it had dominated. However, the technology of war moves at a ruthless pace. The B-29 was the king of the sky in 1945, but just 5 years later, it was a dinosaur. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, the Air Force dusted off the Superfortresses and sent them back into battle. But this time, they weren't fighting prop-driven Zeros. They were fighting MiG-15 jet fighters. The MiGs were fast, swept-wing sharks that could fly circles around the old bombers. The robot tried to keep up. The gears spun frantically. The computers calculated lead angles that were pushing the limits of analog physics. But the age of the propeller was over. The B-29s were mauled by the jets. The invisible wall of the Central Fire Control System, which had been impenetrable to the Japanese, was finally broken by the sheer speed of the jet age. After Korea, the B-29s were sent to the boneyards. It's a sad sight to see a masterpiece of engineering turned into scrap. In the deserts of Arizona, thousands of silver giants were parked in endless rows, baking in the sun. The salvage crews came in with torches and wrenches. They didn't care about the genius of the General Electric engineers. They just wanted the aluminum. They ripped the little black boxes out of the fuselages and threw them into piles. The intricate gears, the glass mirrors, the vacuum tubes, parts that had cost millions of dollars to develop, were crushed into junk. The brains that had saved thousands of American lives were melted down to make soda cans and window frames. But the idea didn't die in the scrapyard. The Central Fire Control System was the seed that grew into something terrifyingly powerful. The military realized that the B-29 had proven a fundamental truth. Machines are better at shooting than men. A human gets scared. A human blinks. A human shakes. A computer does none of those things. The engineers took the lessons from the B-29 and started building the next generation of weapons. They replaced the gears with transistors and then with microchips. They replaced the mechanical cams with software code, but the concept remained exactly the same. A remote operator, a calculating brain, and a gun that aimed itself. If you look at a modern Navy destroyer today, you will see a white-domed robot sitting on the deck. It looks like Art Deco with a Gatling gun. It's called the Phalanx CIWS. It shoots down incoming missiles automatically. It calculates wind, gravity, and speed in a fraction of a second, just like the B-29 system did. When a pilot in an Apache helicopter looks at a target and the gun under the nose swivels to follow his eye, that is the great-grandchild of the B-29 turret. The video game war that Sergeant Billings fought over Tokyo is now the standard way the world fights. The drone operators sitting in trailers in Nevada, flying planes on the other side of the world, are the direct descendants of the gunners sitting in their blister seats, controlling turrets 40 feet away. The legacy of the robot is also written in the lives of the men it saved. There are thousands of grandfathers who came home from the Pacific because the computer didn't miss. They went back to their jobs at gas stations and factories. They raised families. They didn't talk much about the war, and when they did, they rarely talked about the black box. It's hard to tell a heroic war story about a computer. It's much more dramatic to talk about wrestling a stick or fighting a fire. Aiming a remote turret feels cold. It lacks the sweat and grit of the infantry. So, the story of the Central Fire Control System faded into the background. It became a footnote in the technical manuals known only to aviation mechanics and historians. But the gunners knew. They remembered the feeling of the dead man's switch in their hand. They remembered the eerie smoothness of the turret spinning to track a fighter they hadn't even fully recognized yet. They remembered the moment of trust when they decided to let the machine do the work. It was a strange relationship, a man entrusting his life to a box of gears. In a war defined by brute force and raw courage, the B-29 gunners were the first ones to step into the future. They were the first generation to fight a push-button war. They proved that you didn't have to be a muscle-bound warrior to kill the enemy. You just had to be calm enough to trust the math. Today, there are only a few B-29s left in the world. Most are in museums, polished and silent. If you walk through the fuselage of one, you can still see the sighting stations. They look archaic now, like old radios from the 1940s. The plastic knobs are yellowed with age. The glass sights are dusty. The little black boxes are hidden away behind panels, their grease dried up, their gears frozen in time. Visitors walk past them without realizing what they are looking at. They see a bomber and think of the pilots or the atomic bomb. They don't realize they are looking at the great-grandfather of the modern combat computer. The story of the glass bubble executioner serves as a reminder that innovation is often hated before it is loved. The experts laughed at the robot. They called it a toy. They said it would fail. But when the metal was flying and the chips were down, the toy was the only thing standing between the crew and death. It reminds us that the biggest advantage in war isn't always the biggest gun or the fastest plane. Sometimes it's the smartest brain. The engineers at General Electric, working with slide rules and pencils, built a machine that could outthink a samurai warrior in the sky. We rescue these stories to ensure that the genius of the Central Fire Control System doesn't disappear into silence. We tell them because we need to remember that victory often rides on the back of unsung mechanics and engineers. We tell them to honor the gunners like Sergeant Billings, who sat in their plastic bubbles at 30,000 feet fighting the cold and the fear, trusting a mechanical brain to bring them home. They were the pioneers of a new age, the first men to fight with a joystick instead of a trigger. If this story of the glitch that cleaned the skies over Tokyo moved you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps us fight the algorithm and keeps these mechanical histories alive. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the machines that won the war. We are digging through the blueprints every week to find the stories of the hardware and the heroes that changed the world. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We want to hear from the aviation geeks in the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and everywhere else. Tell us if you've ever seen a B-29 up close. Did you notice the turrets? Did you know they were robots? Share your story. You are the keepers of this history just as much as we are. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure the Superfortress is never forgotten.